Most companies don't have a culture problem, they have a comfort problem. Today, Mike Krupit joins me to talk about growth, delegation, and why scaling a company requires you to get uncomfortable long before your business does. Enjoy. Welcome to the No Limits Leadership Podcast. We discuss ancient wisdom, real-world experiences, and the latest concepts on mastering leadership of self and others. If you're committed to maximizing your life and your impact on the world, you're home. Welcome to the No Limit Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Sean Patton, and I am honored to be joined by Mike Krupit today. He is a former startup operator turned trusted advisor to founders and CEOs. Having served as a CTO, COO, and CEO across multiple high-growth companies, Mike now helps leaders navigate the hard transitions that come with scale, from delegation and culture to becoming the leader their organization needs with his company, Trajectify. Mike, thanks for being on today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Really excited. You grew through so many different leadership roles. How did this whole thing start with you, to go from startup founder in these high growth companies and then move up into the C-suite? Like, what was that journey like?
Well, thankfully it wasn't obvious to me that it was happening. Otherwise, I probably would have been too scared. I started my career as an engineer because to someone like myself, like a lot of other founders, computers are a lot more comfortable than people. They're more predictable. And, but little by little, as I went from, growth stage company to growth stage company, I began to have more management and leadership accountabilities, learned the hard way what might not work, eventually found some good coaching and good training and had some good bosses and great mentors and went from CTO to COO to CEO almost seamlessly. Like it was like I was getting my MBA while I was in the trenches because these companies some of them were doubling every 6 months. So it afforded me a lot of opportunities and I didn't have a lot of time to think about it. Now, there was a moment where I almost backed out. I remember that first time that my manager came to me and said, he was actually a co-founder of a Silicon Valley startup. And he said, Mike, you're my only engineer with people skills. I need you to step up into a management role. He had 40 direct reports. He wasn't that great of a manager himself.
Yeah, holy cow.
He offered me no training, no coaching. He wasn't a great mentor. And I came in as a manager and I made every mistake in the book. I went from a 5-star engineer to a 3-star manager. When you're wired, as I was when I was younger, to be a perfectionist, 3 out of 5 is scary. But thankfully, things move so quickly throughout my career. And before I knew it, I had mastered, the organization as opposed to the quick wins of mastering the computers.
That is, whether you're an engineer or in sales or marketing, whenever you move from that sort of like individual contributor technical role and that first leap into, all right, now you have to work by, with, and through others is such a transition in terms of mindset, skill set, framework, measures of success. You mentioned that you kind of made all the mistakes that you could and learned from them. Whether those are your examples or maybe from other companies you've worked with, what are the keys? Well, let's start with the mistakes. What are some of the mistakes that those leaders who are put in that position make that transition? Like, where do they go wrong if they go wrong?
I think one of the biggest ones is an expectation that we can get quick wins, right? So, as an engineer, you write some code, you fix a bug. As a salesperson, you find a deal, you close a deal, you get that immediate gratification. You go home and you say, job well done. And I remember when I was a new manager, I went home to my wife after work one day and said, she asked how the day was. It's like, I spent my entire day in meetings. What a waste. She's like, isn't that your job now? And that was an important aha moment because I was investing in people and process and systems, of course, but it was an organization and the systems that support organization. And it doesn't move as quickly as when you're an individual contributor. So you've got to reset your expectations to say, this is not for today. This is for tomorrow or next month or next year.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that there's a bit of having some faith in the relationship, building the trust, the communication, and the strength that pays out in dividends over time. And I could see how that could be a struggle for if you're someone you've never seen that play out. To have faith in the beginning of the process can be very difficult.
Well, and especially in the startups that I was in, right? My managers, my leaders didn't invest time in me in part because they were also in the trenches. Perhaps we were small organizations. And it wasn't until things got bigger and they brought in professional, seasoned leaders that I got to see what one was like. And so one of the biggest things I do in my own coaching is encourage the regular investment in one-on-ones. A lot of managers don't see, they either use the one-on-one as a status check. Oh, how things going? How's this? They check things off the to-do list or the in progress list, but they're not making investments in the people. They're not in their team. They're not soliciting their feedback. They're not offering continuous feedback. When a problem arises, they haven't been leading up to that. Right? They haven't been sharing the fact that they see a problem brewing. They don't establish rapport with their team. So just dedicating enough time to do one-on-ones with your team on a regular basis, on a bi-weekly or even a weekly basis, is something that a lot of leaders take a while to appreciate the value in doing that.
I couldn't agree more. Do you have, whether it's a strict or sort of loose framework that you like to use for those regular one-to-ones?
There are a whole bunch of different ways to do it. And I typically put the onus on the employee. And so a lot of times when I'm coaching a team, when the employee says, "Oh, my boss canceled our one-on-one," it's just like, well, then just put it back on the calendar. Well, it's not my meeting. Well, yes, it is your meeting. And so I encourage either through shared docs or a performance management system, or even just in the email, like the calendar invites, keep a running agenda. If you're going to meet once a week or every other week, as is common, to just throw what's on your mind into that document, into that appointment, and make sure that you're prepared to talk about them. But the leader should always let the employee set the agenda, should hold the employee accountable to set the agenda, and is there in service to the employee. So for me, it's the simplest system is just to have a shared repository where we're tracking the things we're talking about or the things that we want to talk about.
I'm interested in your take. One thing I've heard, I actually heard this from another leader that I like the approach. So I'm interested in your take on one-to-ones was with, let's call it like very junior leader or junior employees, right? Tenure, whatever that might be. With those, his take was the leader sort of like, I have a little more control. I set that. Here's what we're going to talk about. Here's why, that sort of thing. And then as you work with more senior folks, that like completely flips to where he's like, if I'm talking to a VP, it's like, you're putting the calendar on my meeting. You're setting me the agenda beforehand, all that. Like it was a bit of a flip on like seniority. Have you seen that play out well or not?
Yeah, yes, but also not consistently. So for example, right, somebody may be, because of their strengths or their personality or because of their experience level, may not be comfortable to take ownership of a one-on-one. And so their leader might show them examples of how it's done and coach them or coax them into doing so. But I also think it depends. There's some generational differences. Like, today we're finding younger employees in the workforce today are a lot more outspoken about where they want to go and what they want to be and how they want to get there. And so I think when I was young, telling my boss what I wanted was considered precocious. And today it's kind of almost the standard. And so there is a shift going on in the market, in the employment, in the workforce today, that doesn't necessarily mean juniors won't be good at it.
I love that. And I love, you mentioned a few times, it sounded to me like leading up, like people in the organization, like I love that concept of leadership isn't a position or a title, right? It's like a way of being, right? It's how you show up. So how do you lead? So what I'm hearing from you is, as you are a leader in an organization, because I like to say everybody's got a boss, right? Like a CEO reports to shareholders or stakeholders, like everybody reports to somebody. You're accountable to someone. And so I'm hearing from you is, in order to develop maybe as a leader yourself, do that by leading up and taking charge of that type of growth, asking for what you want, that sort of thing.
Exactly. In our practice, we call it managing up, and that's a common term that we coach people on. And that I was, even though I was facilitating a conversation with a bunch of big corporate executives, right? So big corporations, so even VPs and managing partners at big corporations are still not quite at the top, and they were trying to share some challenges and help one another. And eventually they all realized, man, what we're trying to do here is figure out how to manage up. And because a bunch of people there in that session had problems with their bosses, even chief chief level officers at major corporations. And so managing up is a skill that we need to learn early in our career and practice it.
If you're going to advise someone on putting that managing up into practice, what would be the first couple things you would tell them?
Well, the first thing I always suggest is take ownership of the one-on-one. Make sure it's on the calendar and make sure that you're running it. The second thing is the willingness to be authentic or vulnerable. And so, if you see something, say something. that we see now in the subways and in large cities, post 9/11. The fact is that a lot of employees don't feel comfortable or may not feel safe in being authentic, right? They may throw a peer under the bus. Hey, so-and-so keeps doing this. But I'm really talking about the organization, your relationship with your manager, the manager's decisions, the organization's direction, to share what you think and learn how to do it in a constructive way. And I didn't. I was a precocious young manager. And I remember once I got that 3-star performance review, writing, and I still have it today. I don't know why I saved it because it's on a piece of paper, writing a 3-page rebuttal to my mediocre performance review and how that must have been perceived then. And now, there are better ways. And I was in a safe environment. I didn't get fired for expressing my opinions. That is a leader's job, is to provide a safe environment where people feel like they can say what they want and make mistakes and show up as themselves. But but it's that willingness to be vulnerable and to make yourself vulnerable and be authentic with your manager.
And that is so important, and it can be so difficult. But I know for me, what I found is as a young leader, even in the military and things, where a natural tendency was to be transactional with my relationships. Mm-hmm. And I think I justified it being in the military, like, wait, no, I'm an officer, I've got to keep this level. And I do think there's a level there's a leadership appropriate relationship to have. But I think I erred on the side of not investing too much in the relationship, or getting too involved. And as I matured as a leader, I started recognizing how I feel like there was so much maybe lost opportunity in developing and cultivating that relationship by being vulnerable and offering them a space to do the same thing.
And you would know, way better than I would, but the military is not necessarily the kind of environment where you practice these kind of things. That processes and systems and processes and rule and order is has a critical purpose. And it used to be, I caught myself doing this the other day. It used to be that we often use military analogies in running our businesses. And I used one the other day and I caught myself. I said, you know what? This one's not appropriate anymore. I can't say it this way because it doesn't apply. There's really been a big shift, and the pandemic accelerated it or exacerbated it with all of this distributed and remote work that's happening today, where we have a different relationship with our managers and we have a different relationship with our employers.
Mm-hmm. But when you describe that as that shift through COVID, I've seen that too. What have you seen be effective to keep culture intact, to develop people to lead in those distributed remote environments?
Yeah. So first and foremost, over communication. Nobody's figuring things out by osmosis. They're not having hallway conversations or overhearing something in the conference room. I remember early in my career, I'd bump into my boss in the hallway and he'd say, come into this meeting with me. I want you to hear this. And he'd drag me along places, and we lose those opportunities. So we have to be much more deliberate and much more frequent in our communications. And sometimes multi-channel, say the same thing in a Slack channel, but also post a video about it, also email about it, say it again in a meeting. People may not hear you at the time. It may get lost with the large amount of communication we need now. It could get lost in the noise. So important things need to get repeated in multiple channels. The second thing are systems of predictability, to understand goals and accountabilities and track progress. We sometimes did things informally, especially in the days of open office spaces, open workplaces, where we'd all be sitting in the same bullpen or floor together, and we'd roll our chairs around once in the morning to do a stand-up meeting or an all-hands meeting. We'd chat for 15 minutes and everyone would have their marching orders, and then we'd all roll around at our desks, but we'd still hear what's going on and be able to collaborate spontaneously. And you would know who was succeeding and who wasn't succeeding. And today it's not so obvious. in this day of distributed systems. And so we have to be a little bit more specific about it with systems and processes so people know what the goals are and that we're able to communicate process and demonstrate progress. And then finally, I think there's I'm trying to think of the best word. The word that comes to mind is humanity, right? So when you're with someone in person, we can go out to lunch together. We could build rapport. We can treat them as people. When you're in a Slack channel or a Teams channel or a Zoom meeting or on email, we forget that they're people. And so how can we make sure that interpersonal relationships that exist, that those are often the ties that bonds people together, that creates not only effective workforces but helps with retention. And so how do we not make your relationship with the company or with your manager transactional, as I guess to use that word, right? How do we ensure that people know each other and people like each other and people build those bonds together in this new world in which we work?
Yeah, I think that's great. Those two call outs of kind of creating like communication and like I agree, like, over communication and simplified and predictable communication, all those things. And then you're right, like how do you create those relationships and culture? And what came to mind as we talk about that is with your expertise in high growth companies. So it's one thing to do that in a sort of a static environment. But now as we start to expand and grow in multiples, almost new challenges arise. So when a founder or one of the first partners in a small firm is starting to grow it, so now you just sort of floated into leadership of an expanding company. When you see that, like, how do we tackle that problem? Like, what unique challenges are there?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to that, and I've been talking about that a lot recently because some of my clients have gone into what they call founder mode. So they grew the business to 5 million, 10 million, and things are going well until they're not. And then they do a deep dive. They say, hey, we need to go in and do a deep dive in a particular area of the company, go back into founder mode. In part because maybe they made some wrong hires, in part because maybe their market has changed or the economy, what have you. And so they feel like they've got to go back and be more hands-on, more micromanaging. And sometimes they have trouble pulling themselves out. Now, so the first thing is really, and you hear it talked about a lot, is delegation, right? It's trouble. When you start a business, when you're at a business in the early days and you're forced to wear many hats and have your hands in every piece of the company, to realize that you've gotten to a certain point where you shouldn't be doing all the work, and how to delegate and how to delegate well. So there's a lot written and a lot spoken about delegation, and those of us who struggle with it see the struggle and work very hard at it. But that's really only one immediate layer to it. The other layer is, as I spoke to earlier, understanding the value of your time and the time that you put into people versus the time that you put into your own deep work, and to realize that the gratification that you get, the reward that you get for seeing a job well done, doesn't happen tomorrow. It happens in the end of the quarter or the end of the year. And so there's a lot of emotional shifts, I'll call them, that have to happen. And the founder needs to be resilient enough to do that so that when they do go back into founder mode, they can pull themselves out of it because they see the value. So one of the things that I've done, and I forget where I learned this a while ago, but I saw this ideal job description for a CEO, and it was four accountabilities. First, chief visionary. You create and share the vision. Second is fiduciary accountability. Make sure that the company is financially and legally sustainable. The third is putting the right people in the right seats, making sure you got the right team under you. And the fourth is the outside face and voice of the company, right? So you are, whether it's investors or customers or the press, right? Or your peers, your marketplace, you are the face and voice of the company. And anything else that's not on that list is someone else's job. Now, mind you, when you start the company, everything in the company is your job. So it's that transition to say that I am only uniquely positioned to do these few things, and everything else needs to have people and processes and systems in place.
I love that. Do you find, I found this with several clients, sort of a belief around, yeah, of course we need to invest in and develop our middle managers or, our rising leaders, but then it's like they hit some sort of VP level strategic senior leader threshold, and then it's like, I guess they got it now. Like no more development needed, no more investment needed in those folks. They're my peer, they've got it. And then I've seen that turn into issues down the road. Is that something you see in companies as they scale as well?
Yes. And then, it's easy to detect because people stop growing, even the people at the very top. I've got 35 years of experience in some of these markets and positions, and I still need development. I constantly find new mistakes to make, try not to repeat past mistakes. So I know I need help and I need development. So as someone who doesn't have a boss who's telling me where to, or an organization that's telling me where to find it, it's up to me to go say, I know I need it. So whether it's coaching and mentoring or training or just supportive one-on-ones, everyone in the organization, including the CEO, including the board of directors, needs outside in on emotional perspectives, needs support, needs insight, needs to be challenged to grow as well. We have to challenge ourselves to grow, and the organizations that we're in need to challenge us to grow, which is why performance development plans are a big part of what I challenge leaders to provide, is to make sure with each person in the organization, including the VPs, including all the C levels, to say, well, here's the skills I want to strengthen, or where I'd like to be in a year from now or 5 years from now.
As you watch these founders scale and get to this space, I think I remember you talking about this before, about there's some founders who then can grow into that CEO role, and there's some who, whether it's, I don't know, capability, willingness, whatever, it's better to step aside. And you mentioned like bring in the companies you were a part of, like bring in professional management. What is that decision process like?
Well, first and foremost, it's a very emotional decision process, right? Because you start a company and now this is your baby. It's also a self-awareness challenge in that being able to say, I'm not the right fit for something. So first and foremost, to know what the fit should be and know that what your strengths are, right? So there's multiple levels of awareness. Know what the right answer is, know what your capabilities are, and then be able to acknowledge and accept that it's not you. In the work that I do, 9 times out of 10, investing in that founder can get them there. It takes time, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but a lot of them can get there, and they make a lot of mistakes along the way. And hopefully they have enough resilience in their organization that they're able to survive that. And certainly if they're surrounded by investors, advisors, or coaches or mentors, that someone will prevent them from falling off the cliff. But I'd like to see them try. So often the awareness comes from having tried and failed multiple times. And that's sort of the realization that says, all right, well, maybe it's not me. But I will tell you, and 9 times out of 10, it is them. And that 10% of the time where it's not them, I will say that 9 out of 10 times, the person they pick to succeed them doesn't work out. So in my support for them to help them grow, and then my preparation of, for them to potentially hand off the business, it's to get the business to a point where it can be handed off. So one of the ways where I see that done successfully is to perhaps use an interim executive. So bring on an interim CEO or interim COO, and look from the outside, have someone from the inside out work in the organization to build it up to the point where the baton potentially could be handed off to the next in charge, which may or may not be that or an interim exec.
Yeah. With your company, Trajectify, you do the fractional C-suite work. Is that the type of work that you do?
Yeah, we do some of that.
Step in and help transition that?
Yeah, we do a lot of organizational development, working with the leadership teams on their organization and their strategy and the alignment of those. And then sometimes when we see a company needs a little bit more intensive care, we might suggest place one of our coaches in as an interim executive to do what I say, coaching from the inside out. Like, let's show them how it's done. So like in a product-oriented company, in a product company, often the founder is the visionary for the product. And that's the last piece that they're willing to delegate, to give up. So we'll take an interim chief product officer, put them in the company, have them work with the founder, who's the CEO at the time, and give them a sense of what it's like to have a very senior product organization. So we can wean the founder from it, train the rest of the organization to work with a product organization as opposed to the founder, and then build the systems that provide product management so that we can then eventually replace ourselves with someone in-house or a hire that they make to run the product organization. So we kind of wean them off of, we build the systems to support, to make the new team successful. We come in and do it by coaching from the inside out.
Like, I can see how that approach would be effective. You mentioned like having someone sort of senior in there, and like you said, sort of like wean them off of the thing that they're clinging to. most tightly. There's probably a lot of great lessons for people in similar situations out there. One of the phrases that you said that I would love to expand on a bit is that most companies don't have a culture problem; they have a comfort. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. Well, it's human nature, right? To seek comfort. We got to a place and we are comfortable with where that is. And yet the challenge with an organization is it is constantly evolving. Every new hire you bring in, every growth, new level of growth you achieve, your culture evolves. And to say that this is where we started and this is what makes us a company and to firmly define it stops it from evolving. And a classic story I tell is that I had an organization where one of the co-founders was their head of sales. Now, in my perspective, in getting to know them, they were more of an evangelist, right? There was a lot of inbound interest in the company. It was a very niche market. And this person would very complacently get on Zoom calls with them, show them how amazing the product was, and then, use email to close the transaction. They were not selling. They were just order processing in my assessment. And so I said, you know what? But there's a big part of the market that's untapped who hasn't clicked on the buy now button that triggers this guy into action. And so who's selling? And they weren't selling. And so I said, let's bring in a salesperson. So, we're interviewing salespeople, and finally there's one person who they really see can do the job. And this person is loud and personable and, comes into the office, walk around, greeting everyone, shaking hands, and says, so at the end, I asked them, is this somebody, tell me, debrief on the interviews. And everyone said, well, we really think he can do the job, but we wouldn't want to have a beer with him after work. And I said, so you're saying what? He's not like you. He's different. You're stuck on a culture because you're only hiring people like yourself. And they eventually hired him. And within 2 months, he was outselling the existing salespeople. And I will say that he irritated everyone in the company. So culturally, it was a big shift. They said, oh, he's on the phone all day. It's like, yeah, that's his job. And so it's an example of how they were they try to stay comfortable, and that could have killed the company because they didn't allow the culture to evolve. So we don't have a culture. Culture to me is a living, breathing thing that's created by a number of things: your value system, the people you hire, and your style of leadership.
So is it fair to say that culture, because you want to stay on your value? I mean, maybe I'm making an assumption here. You want to stay on your values. You have company values. You stand for something, right? You don't want to be this brand that just is a logo that doesn't actually stand for anything. But it sounds to me that culture inside the company, you need to adjust and change based on what the outcomes you want from the company. So you're letting sort of vision direct and what culture should happen. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, there are strengths that we know that we need to have on our team in order to achieve the outcomes we want. There are values that we know that our company holds, and we want to only hire people who adhere to those values. And together, those will determine what the culture ends up being, right? We will end up with an organization of people who look like us, who sound like us, who work like us. And that's not going to help us meet our outcomes because we're only as good as the strengths that we have on our team. We need to hire complementary strengths. If I am somebody who's always urgent, and a lot of entrepreneurs are there people who are patient on the team? And do I have will my culture allow me to work with someone who's patient? Because I need both of those strengths on my team.
How do you do what's the assessment look like when you realize we've sort of outgrown this homogeneous culture we've created, and we need to level that up, but that means we may need to relook vision, or maybe we need to look like what we're trying to achieve, what's the bigger purpose here that we're in service to? What does a process look like to even make that assessment? Or does it just happen when you realize growth is slowed, or we're getting overwhelmed, or we've got blind spots because we're all thinking the same way?
So I like to differentiate between the vision and the mission. And that is a very common framing for it. The vision is why you started the company. Why did we build this? Why do we exist? That almost never changes. Companies sometimes stick with their vision for decades, if not, 3-4 decades. I know some companies have stuck with their vision. They evolve very slowly. Our mission changes very frequently, right? Because how we work towards that vision, we have to iterate through. I used to say when I started my career, 3 years, 3 to 5 year mission, right? Today, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like we change our mission every quarter because things around us are changing so rapidly. Like AI is disrupting so much that you probably can't sit on a 3 year mission. But if we know that point on the horizon, that vision that where we want to sail towards, how do we craft a path there? And that's what I'll call our mission. And the mission is certainly something that changes frequently because we're constantly getting feedback on it.
That makes total sense. What, in terms of that outward, you talk about the CEO, like one of his jobs is that visionary, looking out into the world and deciding how we're going to play with all that. How is that feedback loop? Because I think so many companies do that very well. I think companies very struggle with that. Sometimes that feedback comes from different places in the organization that maybe feedback's the wrong word. Maybe it's data or observation or thoughts that something's a little, we're missing an opportunity or this thing's going to really change. But the structure of putting, let's just say, feedback or vision or communication down and then having a system to actually feed it back up based on what responses we're getting from the system. How does that function inside these high-growing organizations?
I definitely encourage organizations to revisit their vision every year. Or maybe now every quarter, now that I think a year feels like it's too much. So when you're doing that planning, that quarterly planning or that annually planning, you take out your vision, you say, this is why we're here. And then you've got to see if that resonates, right? Does that make sense anymore? Are the people you're hiring, now versus the people you hired 5 years ago, do they get the vision? Do they understand it? Can they recite it? And does the vision lead in these planning cycles? Does the vision lead us to craft these missions that move us forward to get us the outcomes that we set, the goals that we want to meet? And then, so if any of those are answered no, like they're not, right? We're not meeting the outcomes, or the goals are no longer make sense, or we're having trouble crafting a mission, or our people don't understand our vision. Maybe that's at that point, you take that step back and said, well, have things around us changed so much that why we exist needs to evolve?
And when you are trying to, I'm going to switch back to individual leadership a bit. So we talk about organizational leadership, and you talk about the importance of continual growth and development as a leader. And I use leader of self, of family, of community, of business, all around, and do that. Where do you? I guess I see a spectrum. I see some people I feel like are just like on this like personal development, like IV drip, just like the newest, greatest thing all the time, but not kind of like spinning their wheels and almost maybe not getting somewhere in the long term as much. And I see people who, to your point, like maybe I do the job and that's, I'm going to learn by osmosis, right? I'm going to learn by just doing this thing will get me to the next thing. And then there's somewhere in the middle. And so when you work with leaders or you step in, like how do you help them frame where to prioritize and how to carve out time and energy to their own personal development?
So the decades later, I'm still a fan of Stephen Covey's time management quadrants or the Eisenhower quadrants, right? And so I like it because of its simplicity, right? That we're measuring two factors, importance and urgency. And that most of the errors that leaders make is in how they're allocating their time, what's important, deciding what's important, because urgency is often masked as importance for them. And so for me, I'll sit there and look at their calendar with them and say, how much quadrant 1, right? Time are you spending, important and urgent, versus how much quadrant 2, important but not urgent, are you spending? Are you spending so much time fighting fires in quadrant 1 that you're not making investments in quadrant 2? Because quadrant 2 is, I want to see you there 60, 70% of the time. And so sometimes it's just giving them that language for them to be able to say, here's how I'm investing in me or my organization or my business versus, here's just me spinning my wheels, making sure important stuff doesn't catch fire. And so it is a understanding. I try to shift them into at least the discipline of spending more time on themselves, on their team, on their business. Look, it's if you want to get more fit, eat healthy and go to the gym. And does it matter which program you follow at the gym or which program you subscribe to for your dietary habits? The fact that you're spending time thinking about it and working on it is sometimes all you need, is just that awareness and that discipline to go do it, right? So if I go to the gym 5 times a week, doesn't matter what I do, really doesn't matter what I do at the gym. Just the fact that I'm going is going to make me healthier than if I chose not to go or if I really chose not to go.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I remember my first business, was a gym, and I was in a gym and fitness business for a while. And one of the first things you learn about with like personal training plans is just by getting people to track their food for 7 days, everyone loses like 5%. It's like
Yeah.
just the awareness of like, and the discipline of like, I'm actually going to pay attention to what I put in my mouth. Like just that that awareness creates immediate results.
Right. Or it creates accountability, even if it's only accountability between yourself and your coach or your trainer, right? I don't want to write donut down, so I'm not going to eat it.
Exactly. No, I love that. And I love the use of the, Eisenhower matrix or urgent important matrix. I was just having a conversation with a client with that recently. It's in my book too, just sort of a classic way to think about it. When you see leaders in these organizations, you mentioned Quadrant 1, urgent and important, putting out fires. And my interpretation of that is happens for two reasons: unforeseen emergencies, which is life, and letting things get there. Quadrant 2 being important, not urgent. So that's, you mentioned developing yourself, developing people in your organization, working on the business, growing in larger capacity, investing in relationships. And then Quadrant 3, urgent, not important. And that is the one where it gets fuzzy. Even people ask me like, what are some examples? I'm like, I try to like email, I try to like list things out, but I do feel like it's so easy to get sucked into it. And it's almost like I know it when I see it, but like, where do you see leaders go wrong with Quadrant 3 and getting stuck in doing work that seems important because it's urgent, but it's really not?
Right. Those are the leaders who value themselves by how busy they are and who will allocate 2 hours a morning to go through emails and to write, or spend all night or all weekend writing a 40-page PowerPoint presentation to try to communicate something. The fact is that that is maybe self-importance. Maybe that's a way to label that. But here's an observation lately. That quadrant is being disrupted by AI. I had a client the other day ask me, I spend all day talking to Claude. Is that okay? What he's having Claude do is all the things he would have been doing in Quadrant 3 rather, right? All the stuff that seems urgent but not important that might have distracted him, he's having Claude take care of. So I think Quadrant 3 the urge to stay in Quadrant 3 starts to diminish when we let AI help us, right? Back in my days, when my first CEO job, I had a full-time MBA assistant. They worried about all the Quadrant 3 stuff for me. Made sure my calendar was optimized, made sure my filing system was optimized, made sure my email, I only saw the important ones. That's Quadrant 3 stuff, right? And so, highly effective executives don't spend time in it or delegate it, but AI is now displacing it. So I think especially, smaller organizations and their founders are so enthralled by AI that I'm optimistic that AI is going to get them out of Quadrant 3.
And hopefully not push them back up into the fires of Quadrant 1, but push them into, maybe I can expand this into some spaces.
Well, if they're working with me, I'm going to try to hold them accountable to that.
Yeah, all right. Exactly. You and me both, brother. We're on this battle together. Mike, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for your time today and the work that you're doing. We'll have all of your links in the show notes with Trajectify and all of that. But if someone wants to try to like reach out and get a hold of you or find out what you're putting out, like where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, you can just Google my name, Mike Krupit, Krupit, or you can reach me at Mike at Trajectify, Trajectify.com. I still, even though I have AI in my inbox, I still see all the emails personally.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, brother. I appreciate it.
Great. I enjoyed the conversation, Sean. Thanks for the time.
Thanks for being a part of the No Limit Leadership family. This isn't just a podcast. We're building a movement of no limit leaders driven to unlock our greatness and lead the world forward. If this made you think or gave you something useful, please, 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 right now, go hit follow and then share it with one leader you believe in. Challenge limits, develop leaders, fuel greatness.